afternoon, and welcome to the January 16th Council work session. And our first item of business is a work session on single-use containers and utensils.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michael Wist from PDD to launch the conversation.
Great. My presentation started just in time. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for having me here today. I am Michael Wist. I'm the Program Manager for the Waste Prevention and Green Building team. And I'm here to talk about single-use plastics. I'd like to map the issue or the conversation today a little bit. Today, I'll be going over the issue created by single-use plastic pollution, some of the materials and alternatives, a little bit of examples of what other communities have done around the issue, and some state legislation currently being reviewed. So what is a single-use plastic? It's simply a plastic device that is used once. It's non-recyclable. So when you think about it, this is something that might be used seconds at a time, minutes at a time. Understanding plastic and most of it's not being recyclable, that means it accumulates after a while and takes a very long time to break down. So has a long life, it's a long-lived material. And because of its accumulation, it tends to be more and more prevalent every year as it builds faster than it degrades. Single-use plastics include many different kinds of plastics. A lot of it has to do with packaging, whether it's direct packaging, what contains your material, or fill for shipping containers. A lot of the discussion in the past few years has revolved around ocean pollution due to plastics. And we'll focus some of our numbers on that. With ocean pollution, 80% of it, by current studies, is generated from land. And roughly 20% is marine generated, meaning dumping at sea, fishing applications, other things like that. Now, to frame it globally, the U.S. right now is 20th, if you exclude all the coastal European nations, in land-based ocean plastic pollution. The leading countries, top 19, are all characterized by poor solid waste infrastructure, which luckily is not a problem in the United States. You're also looking at countries that have large populations with poor infrastructure along major waterways, which helps facilitate plastics getting into the ocean.
Me in the queue too.
And looking at it from an infrastructure standpoint, if you look at the difference between the U.S. and China, while it's steep, if you look at the percent of mismanaged waste, this is where the infrastructure issue speaks for itself, where the United States has a 2% mismanaged waste percentage, but China itself has 76, and China's not even the worst up there. When you look at waste generated, now this is million metric tons per year. This is where the infrastructure piece comes in again. At worst, the U.S. generates about 110,000 tons of plastic ocean-bound waste annually, where China, at its worst, generates 3.5 million metric tons of waste. But one thing you'll notice here is the waste generated per capita. So what we generate on average compared to a regular Chinese citizen, and we more than double that. So this is where it becomes more of a consumption-based issue.
Is that the 2.58?
Right.
Yeah. And while we're talking about consumption, I'd like to pair this with our climate recovery ordinance discussions that have been going on. So speaking of consumption, this would definitely fall into the consumption bucket as we've split out our greenhouse gas emissions into consumption, buildings, and transportation. While single-use plastics themselves represent a very small piece of the emissions locally, it shouldn't preclude conversation about what the greenhouse gases are for plastic alternatives, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So looking at a global scale, while we do generate a lot per person, the U.S. is not the most egregious generator in the world. And from a greenhouse gas perspective, single-use plastics aren't the most impactful policy piece to address. But we should look at this from a local problem, as a local problem with litter. Solve Oregon sends out volunteers on a regular basis, and they document their findings on Oregon beaches. And it breaks down like this. Number one, litter item, so this is per item, is cigarette butts, followed by plastic tops, straws, and stirrers. Following that is food wrappers and containers, wrappers being anything from bags of chips to foil to you name it. Number 4 are plastic bags, which as you know are banned in Eugene. And 5 are plastic bottles, many of which are recyclable. What you're seeing in other communities is a focus on addressing single-use plastics from a serviceware standpoint, basically what restaurants are giving their customers both for dine-in and carry-out purposes. It's definitely one component, as you've seen in the beach study. It's also, I think it's being addressed primarily because it's something that's usually within a local government's realm of control, rather than national packaging standards and the technologies involved with that. There's also seemingly endless alternatives, and we'll get to that. So this is where the show and tell part starts. Right here are your quintessential plastic single-use carry-out containers. You could pass those around the table.
It's empty.
Never seen them before.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
We reuse them in our office, so.
Jeez.
That's the most basic. Up until recently, many people thought those clamshells were recyclable. They have not been in our system for as long as the system is operated. And you're also seeing, and we'll get to this, many other communities have addressed or are addressing polystyrene. Comes in 2 forms, a rigid form and a foam form. We can just pile them up right here, yeah. I'll let the next group take care of them. So these are kind of the quintessential single-use items that we're used to seeing that gain a lot of the attention, particularly the straws. I think it's worthwhile to talk about what some of the alternatives these would be if we're talking about limiting access to these. So first, I'd like to talk about compostable plastics. So these have become a very hot topic with processors lately. When I say processors, I mean large-scale composting facilities. We have Rexius and Lane Forest products locally. As a material, as a replacement, it's a very energy-intensive material to make. It's corn-based, which requires massive agricultural operations and processing operations, and a lot of energy inputs. If you were to put that in your compost bin, just your regular backyard pile, it would stay there for a very, very, very long time. They're only commercially compostable. And even then, when you get too many of them, it can throw the mix of a commercial composter off, meaning they don't break down evenly, it takes much longer than they normally would, and then those contaminants end up in the compost and look like plastic and turn a lot of people off. From a consumer standpoint, they're easily confused with plastic, so you get people thinking things are compostable, then throwing plastic in the compost. They have poor heat performance, so if you ever try to drink soup out of one of those things, or they've sat in your cup holder for too long in your car, you might have found that out. And when it's not commercially composted, it acts a lot like plastic. It needs a special facility to break down. When those pieces end up in the ocean, in our rivers, in our ditches, they act just like plastic and remain a long-standing, hard-to-decompose litter item. I'd like to talk about other compostables. These are often paper-based, cardboard-based, or wood-based. These are usually the more expensive alternative, but they've gained a lot more acceptance lately. The one consideration with these is that if we're not changing behaviors and changing customer behaviors to identify what is compostable and not, those go to a landfill just like trash would. And when you're sending organic materials to a landfill, if and when they do degrade, they turn into methane and carbon dioxide. So that's a greenhouse gas consideration. Wood, like what that fork is made of, is currently 15% of our landfill. So you'd be adding to the organic landfill issue. And finally, send all those around. I'd like to talk about paper products, kind of paper products, products that look like other compostables. As that goes around, I would encourage you just to stick a finger inside each one and give it a gentle little rub. You'll find, if you don't see that it's shiny, you'll find that it's pretty slippery. All those products are not compostable, though many people would think if you go to campus, if you go to a Starbucks or a coffee shop, you see those cups in the recycling all the time. You see those bins in the recycling. Those are lined with plastic, which make them, some might be biodegradable, but cannot be accepted in a compost facility because of that. And the paper piece in there, I just wanted to highlight, has given considerable problems to our local processors. It's basically a grease barrier. If you were to order French fries or something like that, or sandwiches will come wrapped in it. It's covered in basically a Teflon coating, which is, which if you haven't heard, is both along the lines with polystyrene as a public health issue, in that most people, I think all people have it in their system somewhere. It then can leach into our food. If it gets into the compost somehow, then leaches into the compost. So I sound like I'm being really gloomy right now. Oops, and I haven't changed slides. That's how enmeshed I've been. So moving to multi-use serviceware. The previous examples, unless there is behavior change, can still all end up as litter items. So we're just changing the look of our litter locally is essentially what would be happening. Where we have the most impacts would be encouraging multi-use serviceware, so durables or reusables. These are items, much like we have in our kitchens, that can be washed and reused. Dine-in is pretty simple. I'll get to some examples of what communities have done to regulate dine-in and what you can access. Carry-out, there are more and more examples of actual reusable carry-out containers, much like you would bring this reusable grocery bag to a grocery store. The considerations with those is that they require restaurant infrastructure to clean for dine-in, and maybe clean people if you haven't brought in a clean container. And so there are quite a few restaurants around town that don't have those cleaning infrastructures, or food carts and similar things like that would find that a challenge. And real quick, here's an example of a reusable. This is one we had in the office. It's foil-based, which means it can be recycled, cleaned and reused, and is also domestically recyclable.
Including the lid.
It depends on the lid. That lid would probably go in the garbage. But there are options for that as well. So when we look at types of regulation, I can just categorize these into three different things. One is an all-out ban, where you're basically eliminating access to certain kinds of materials. The second would be types of incentives or disincentives, and this is where behavior change comes in. Typically, these are financial. Discounts, if a customer brings in a cup or a container, those aren't always super successful unless it's a considerable discount, but it is an option. Yep, deposit. So if you were to put a deposit on a reusable item, like if a restaurant were to encourage them to bring it back, that's another approach. Restaurants putting a deposit, much like our bottle bill, on reusable containers, so it encourages customers to bring them back for a refund or just to reuse again. Or similar to the structure of our bag ban is instituting a fee for a non-reusable item, in the case paper bags this time. And another way is to limit convenience. We have some communities that are looking at only making these items, they're available, but only available upon request. One of these communities is Seattle, Washington. Currently, they have banned styrofoam serviceware. single-use plastic bags, and just last year banned disposable plastic straws and disposable plastic utensils. And they've placed restrictions on what plastics are accepted for dine-in only if they're compostable or recyclable. Takeout must be compostable or recyclable, so no plastics in takeout. And compostables must be approved by local processors. Another example is Berkeley, California. So for a while now, they've had banned polystyrene containers and single-use plastic bags. And they're currently weighing a proposal, which was brought by their Zero Waste Commission, about banning disposable serviceware for all dine-in purposes. So if you go to a restaurant, you would not get any disposable serviceware while you were seated. These restrictions would include, now these haven't been passed yet, all carryout serviceware has to be approved by the city, and that list will be updated annually. There's a 25-cent charge on each carryout serviceware item, so per cup, per container. And to compensate the administrative costs of this, the city collects an at-cost fee from each restaurant, separate than the 25-cent deposit. Our last example for today is Portland. They recently passed well, they already have banned for about 30 years now polystyrene foam containers and have a single-use plastic bag ban. And this was effective this July. They will have for dine-in, you can only, you only get plastic serviceware if the customer requests it. For all carry-out, nothing can be given the customer unless they agree to it after being asked by the restaurant staff. So the restaurant staff has to initiate a carry-out question for all serviceware. But their current regulation only affects plastic straws, stirs, utensils, and condiment packaging. So it's really just to limit, make it a little less convenient to carry out more than you need in those circumstances. Currently at the state, just wanted to provide an update. There are two bag ban bills from the House, 2509 and 2653, that may affect our local bag ban in very minor ways. It would increase the amount that we would charge from 5 to 10 cents. Both very similarly worded, so we're monitoring those. But there's also two proposed straw bills, House Bill 2670 and Senate Bill 90, both of which would prohibit restaurants from providing single-use plastic straws to consumers unless they're requested. So very much like the Portland model, but straw specific. So with that, I'd like to open it up to council for any questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for that. I have Emily, Mike, and then Alan in the queue, and Greg. Okay, take it away, Emily.
Thank you very much for that report and the examples. That was really illuminating. I have heard a lot about wood being worse for or paper being worse, and that the coated things can't be used. So I think that makes solutions a little difficult, but not impossible, because some cities have done this. Portland's banned polystyrene for 30 years, I think, so that's worked out okay. It's my intention with this work session, and I do have a motion after our conversations, was to be bold and to stop this now. I think that eventually this will all happen, but you know, Portland's done part of it and we haven't, and we like to be forerunners. And I think that this is a chance for us to really make a statement and to make some difference, both through the behavioral changes and possibly substituting different, better materials that, this reuse, the recycle, the compostable makes it really difficult. But I think the time is right. I think that we should include polystyrene, obviously, and straws. I know some people need straws. We could have paper ones or on request. But I really think we should go farther and really make all single use at takeout and restaurants, catering and nonprofit food servers from doing this. And if you have to bring your own plate and your own dish, well, lots of the natural food stores, you bring a glass jar to put your honey in. And I'd be really interested to see what other people think, so I'm going to ask for a public hearing to get that input. I think that your presentation was incredibly useful, and I would encourage the public to watch this. I like the fees for non-reusable. Some people have said charge a fee and the business gets most of the money, and I don't like that because it would encourage businesses to promote takeout containers. I think the available on request is going to be important for some things. So I hope that you'll support this. I hope we can take it farther than other cities. I think we should be encouraged that other cities have done this, and I forget which one or more have actually done a ban on all single-use plastics. It's an evolving field, but we have the CRO, and even if it's not a big part of our gas emissions, at this point, trying to reach those numbers, we need every single bit. Thanks.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. I appreciate it. Please don't take this personally. This applies, I'm talking, I suppose, more to our acting city manager today for the sake of all departments that make presentations. That happens frequently. And so it happened again with this one as a happenstance, that we're often asked, in fact, we have only one option to vote yes or no on a question, whatever the question is. The presentations that we get from staff would be much more helpful to me if we could outline all of the pros and cons, both sides, of the yes or no to any question that comes before council. This was a good presentation, but the only things presented were supportive of a yes vote. Then there was nothing presented here that talks about the wisdom of a no vote. And I'm not saying that as an idea, this isn't a good idea. I'm saying there are legitimate other issues and questions that are raised as a result of saying no, for example, to this question. I wrote 3. Number 1, in the 19 countries that you listed there, an awful lot of time in those particular countries, I would think, just off the top of my head, I don't have any empirical data to support this, but it would occur to me that in a lot of those countries where they don't have sanitary capacity as high as we do in this country, that single-use plastics keep people from getting sick. And I wonder the extent to which sickness or sterile conditions are a part of any of the things that we do as well. I know that there was some discussion, for example, with the bag ban about people who don't ever wash their grocery bags, you know, and it leaks meat from the, you know, and so there's the potential for E. coli and something they're putting new food in, or anybody that's ever had food poisoning knows that's no fun. The other one would be energy. So if everybody washed all the dishes that they use rather than had any single-use dishes, what would the energy use difference be to heat that water to a sterile condition? Wouldn't that be a fairly dramatic increase in energy demand? I don't know the answer. That's a legitimate question. And the other one is about equity. The cost that you're going to incur from the change of how we use some of these single-use things, some of them are created to be terribly inexpensive, because especially with takeout food, you'll have different deciles of incomes that have a higher or lower tendency to make use of those. It would occur to me that you may make things considerably more expensive for those least able to afford the expense. Thank you.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That's a good presentation. It's always good to have visual aids, show and tell. On the Portland ban, one of the proposed restriction was on condiment packaging. What does that mean? Are you talking about the little ketchup?
The little ketchup and mustard.
Sure. What are they made out of?
I'm not exactly sure. I think it's some kind of a laminate almost, so a number of different
So when you s-
non-recyclable materials.
So when that's limited to, that means only if available upon request.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
their definition of serviceware was limited to straws, condiment packages, and stirrups.
oh, that's the difference.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So would that prohibit a store vendor shop from having a bin where you can just grab 5 ketchups out of it?
They have to keep them behind the counter, I believe, so they have to request them, has to have a face-to-face, interaction.
Sounds like has anybody ever done a life cycle cost analysis of cradle to grave or manufacturing to landfilling analysis of this? I mean, I can see, for instance, utensils are pretty cheap, but when you incorporate the cost of landfilling them and all of that cost, has anybody done that kind of analysis, cradle to grave manufacturing to landfilling?
I would have to take a look at specifically what items have been done. DEQ has been doing a lot of work through their materials management program from the past couple of years in this. That's created some of the information we have about the compostables. And then the purpose of this presentation was to just talk about it at a higher level, to get into some of these details as well. So looking at a life cycle analysis for certain materials, we definitely could do that.
Yeah, that would be interesting because a lot of the disposable stuff that we have in our society shifts cost away from the initial point of interaction with it to something else. Like, for instance, if you're throwing it away, it costs money to do that and it's embedded someplace else. You're just not seeing it at the point of use. So there's a cost of the garbage increase for now plastics, and there's a cost of landfilling, all that stuff. And so, but and also included in that is the energy use. But most of the energy use is actually related to the manufacturing. So I would say, and probably the vast majority of that, probably in the 70% range, is on the energy use is going to be embedded, even if you wash it. So the polystyrene, Portland banned that in 1989.
89,
Yeah, okay, so what have they done, what have vendors done instead of? Have they shifted to the other non-recyclable stuff?
I would assume as much. I don't have the information, but I would assume since there's so many other variables.
That would be good
alternatives.
To find out. Also on the straws part, I think it's a no-brainer interim step to shift to upon request that seems, I don't use straws at all. I know some people have to use straws, so that's important, but I always get a straw and I always give it back. And so, and I'm sure there's thousands of people that are in the same boat as me. So if you need a straw, you can get one. Last time I was in Hawaii, they have no plastic straws. Every straw that you got, even when I didn't ask for it, was paper. And they work great. They only have to last for like half an hour. So, and they all worked perfectly well. So I didn't see any plastic straws at all. And they, of course, now have a statewide plastic ban last year, which was 6 years after we did it. And they're an island. So on the deposit part, I authored the recyclable bag ordinance is what it's actually called, back in 2012, which is the bag ban. But the 5 cents was because the paper was more expensive than the plastic. And to reimburse the stores for that additional cost is why we had that 5 cent there, as well as the fact that it's the bottle bill model. If you have to pay for something, it becomes valuable. If you just get it for free, it's not as valuable. So it actually incentivizes people to do that. And that's why we have such a high adherence to that bottle bill.
Greg?
Thanks. A couple of questions and kind of follow up to what Alan was just saying about Hawaii and the paper straws. What are some of the collateral best practices in terms of emerging technologies that are more biodegradable? Besides, paper straws or, some other kind of facility that would replace, plastic silverware or, even talking more or less about the containers. The containers I see are a little bit easier to make that transition and shift because some of my favorite takeout restaurants in town use polystyrene. I've seen some of them that have moved away from that and more towards cardboard. What are some of those best practices and collateral utensils or uses and other things that have emerged from some of the regulations that have been applied in Berkeley and Seattle and Portland and other places?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There's a lot still emerging on this front as more awareness is being raised around it. The examples I passed around are probably the most prevalent, where you have the cardboard, then you have the unacceptable cardboard ones as well. I haven't tried them yet. I've heard of straws that are being made out of basically like flour, so it's like a hollow noodle you drink out of, and eventually it becomes limp or falls apart. I don't know what happens. So I think there is some more organic-based innovation happening around that, but on the very forefront of it, I'm not exactly sure. And how many of those are viable business models? That'll be something to follow up on.
Yeah, is there something that you can maybe collect for us that, you can shoot us in a short document that kind of gives us an idea of, those kinds of businesses and, developments that, we can, really kind of dial into this as I think we're, from my perspective, I really want to move in this direction. I think that, Emily's work session on this is more than timely. It's probably past time. And, I think that we really need to be ready for the pivot to more organic materials being used in, food service and other areas of that nature.
Hey, Chris.
Thank you. Great presentation, really very informative. And I will confess, part of this for me was a great surprise that I've been going all this time thinking, oh, I'm sustainable, I'm environmentally conscious, and then you pass around material and go, oh, darn, I guess I'm not as much as I thought I was. And that could be a surprise for many of us to realize we are not as sustainable as we have thought we are. And so we need to begin to process how we can move in the right direction, which brings me to the notion of what Greg just said and what Emily's talking about. Yes, we absolutely need to do something. And for me, the question is, how fast do we move and how far do we go, and what is the timing for what we do? And so I want to move. I'm just trying to think what's the best rate that we need to go that's going to achieve the best outcome and provide the best balance. And I'll give you an example of one of these balances I'm talking about. It's come up now for me more than once in conversations. And I guess if I were to try to summarize it, it would be who gets a pass on pollution? And by that I mean, if you look at the cars being driven right now in Eugene, if you consider which cars on the road right now are probably the most polluting cars, they're the older models, the ones that people can afford. If I'm driving a late model new car, it's much less polluting than a 20-year-old, maybe not as well maintained vehicle. So the question is, if I want to create an emission standards program where you have to get a slip before you can drive your car in a vehicle inspection, will that create an undue impact on lower income people who can't afford to maintain their vehicles as well as someone else? It's an unintended consequence, but it creates a direct conflict between two very desirable interests. An interest in helping and supporting low-income people, but also an interest in preserving the environment. And so you say, to what degree do we compromise or let pass in the interest of some other area? When I know Parks Department goes to clean up campsites, one of the things they discover in enormous quantities when they clean up campsites is disposed of wrappers, clamshell containers, plasticware, and stuff like that. And I would want to know, well, what is the alternative for people of low income, people who can't afford? And since this is Alan's subject, he's already raised his hand. I'm sure he has some options, and I'm really interested in hearing them, because for me, it's a dilemma. If I want to deal with an environmental issue and I want to deal with it forthrightly and effectively, I don't want to have the unintended consequences of creating burdens in another area around which I have an interest. And what do we need to do? And this is why I'm saying I want to move at a pace that's very deliberate so that I don't create these unintended consequences as I try to solve one problem. So I'm very committed to solving it. I just want to do it in a way that creates the best outcome.
Eddie?
Thank you. That brought up something else for me. I think definitely we should consider what are the unintended, the unexpected, the undesirable consequences of anything we do. But that brought up disposable diapers. Totally off the subject, but that's something we probably should ban. And also, when you think of consequences, if you don't drive the old cars and we're manufacturing more new cars, which is not environmentally good. So using more materials. Every time I pick up after my dog, I think, would it maybe be better to leave it there than to put it in the garbage? I don't know. I do pick up. But one unintended consequence of our paper, charge for paper bags, which I think are good, are compostable and should be free. But one consequence of that is people are having to buy plastic bags to put their garbage in, which they wouldn't have done if they got free paper bags. So we may be adding to the plastic disposables. But my question, I liked your show and tell, that was very good. That helps to have things to look at. Are those last two comparable?
Compostable.
Those two cardboard, they're the...
The pizza one on top is, and the one that's holding it is not.
The big one is not compostable.
This one's non-compostable. It has a plastic lining on the inside.
Oh.
This one has no plastic
Okay.
glossy lining.
So all the cardboard is not equal.
Yeah, just pay attention. It varies. Even we did a sample yesterday, Devron and I, who will be up here shortly, and we found 2 different types of containers in the same stack at one of our local grocery stores. So,
Well, on one hand, being poor is no excuse for polluting. On the other hand, if you're poor, you go out to eat and you really need that take-home food for another meal. And maybe you could afford to go out to eat if you are able to take half of it home and have it the next, or give it to someone who's at home. But I think there's no question we should ban the polystyrene and that they shouldn't be used at all. I'm wondering what the restaurant business will be saying about a ban. And I did notice, too, that the Halt Center is no longer giving straws with your wine to take into the concert unless you ask for them, which means it's easier to pour the wine on yourself. Thank you.
I have Alan for a second queue, and I know Emily has something to put on the table, but I just wanted to, I have sort of 3 comments, and one is that what we're kind of fundamentally asking for is a behavior change, is that people think differently about how they do it, just as we, are using refillable water bottles and people are walking around with mugs. We're asking people to change their behavior. So it seems to me we want to look at this ordinance with that in mind, like how do we help people change their behavior and sort of coax them in the direction we want. The other piece, I'm actually struck by Mike's comments about the economics of it, and knowing from talking to the folks at Bring also that the economics are not always what you think they are, that one of the reasons we use so much plastic is so cheap. It's cheap to manufacture. So when we start shifting to some, as opposed to behavior change, but just shifting to the same behavior but a different product, we're not addressing the sort of economic issue at all. And so it would be interesting to have a little bit of a framework around that information. And then the final thing is, I'm thinking as you pass these things around, that I would hope if we do this, that we would have a list of recommended items, because it's clear that the aluminum thing is the most reusable and washable. I don't know what the economics of that are in terms of the cost of manufacturing aluminum and distributing it, but it seems to me that we are both trying to address the behavior change and the economics, and it would be helpful if the city, as part of this, we're also rolling out what is your recommended product alternatives. So those are my thoughts there. And so Alan, and then I'm assuming Emily needs to come back. Take it away.
Yeah, to finish the thought about the 5 cent, I mean, that it does put value on it, so it makes it more of a an incentive to do the alternative, which is to bring your own bag. I mean, I wrote the darn thing and I always forget my bag, so I end up using paper bags for garbage liners and whatnot. So sometimes I buy them for 5 cents, but it also creates that value, which is the same idea that I think is behind the deposit on it, or the charge on serviceware that you use in takeout. If you charge someone 25 cents for a packet of silverware and a takeout container, they're going to think twice whether or not they need to take it. And that's a nominal fee, but maybe you don't need it. If you're bringing it home, you certainly don't need it because you have silverware at home. So there are certain circumstances where they're not available, but the deposit idea has a lot of, I think, value in it. But like the mayor said, it is behavioral change that we're trying to do, and those kind of incentives where you say you have to ask for one incentivizes people to do the behavior change. Charging a small fee for it creates that behavioral change. I think that's the kind of way that I think we should be heading as well. When you talk about talking to Carolyn Stein, when you talk to her about plastic, she goes kind of Twitter-pated about it because plastics is not that big of a deal in terms of the landfill. It's a very small portion of it, but it is, and it's a small portion of our waste stream. But if you're going to focus attention, you should be really focusing on food. Food waste and dealing with food is a huge, gigantic issue, and the benefits of dealing with that are so much higher in terms of greenhouse gases and energy and all the different things you can do with it. When Steve Hawkins was in town about his drawdown book, which I bought and I'm reading right now, he drew a box that said of all the things, the 100 solutions that they had that would help us reduce greenhouse gases and resolve climate change. He put them all in one big box as a percentage of the overall picture. The whole top third of that box was about food. Food was the biggest number one thing. We're doing some more stuff on food and doing the composting of that, but that's a bigger deal than this, but this is still important, and we still should try to incentivize behavioral change. Oh, and one more thing, that compostable, my wife is a master gardener and a master composter, so we have a compost bin, and so I put in one of those cups and another plate that said it was compostable into our home one, and 3, 4, 5 months later, pulled it out. They didn't even change at all. They looked exactly the same. You could drink out of it and eat off of it. It takes a commercial composting facility which has very high heats, like 160 to 180 degrees, which you can't get unless you do a hot pile in your compost. So it doesn't do anything until it gets up into that temperature. Then it breaks down and it's compostable.
Okay, Christy, did
Mayor,
you
I just
have?
had one quick comment. One is I wanted to acknowledge your ideas, Councilor Clark, about improving our process. We're continually looking for ways to put council in a better position to have the best information possible. So we'll definitely continue to work on this, and whatever the group needs brought back on this topic, we'll do our best to get that to you in a timely manner.
Thank you. Okay, I have Betty wanting a second round, and then I'm turning it over to Emily.
Okay, the food rate just reminded me, if we ask restaurants to charge for takeout containers, it would discourage people from taking the leftover food, which then would make more food waste. So I think that's one of the consequences we should think about. If you've spent a lot of money to go out to eat, you paid the tip and all that stuff, and then they say 25 cents for a container, say, oh, keep it, and more wasted food. Thank you.
A quick one, Mike?
Yeah, I was just saying, Betty's point is extremely well taken, as are many. We're making a lot of suppositions here, so I wouldn't mind the idea of us having much more information brought forward and having much more robust conversations here, but I wouldn't say we're in a position to make any decisions about moving any actions forward, just because there's so many questions that we're all bringing up about what we don't really know, what the unintended consequences of some of these choices are. So I would just urge my friend that I'm in, let's have the conversation. There are way more questions than answers here at the table so far.
Okay, well, I leave it to you, Emily. Take it away.
Okay, just a couple of comments about the cars and regressive part of that. I've been urging since the beginning for free buses. If you can't afford a car, get on the free bus. I bet a lot of people, no payments, no insurance, no repairs, no gas. The paper bags are the best value in town. What else can you buy for 5 cents? I use them until they fall apart. Plastics are cheap. But saving the climate isn't cheap, So if this costs more money, I think we need to also think about how serious are we about the CRO, and we're not making those numbers. If this makes another %, we might live longer. Food waste, we are, working on that. What I do is I bring one of those Tupperware containers with me, and if I'm at a place where we've got paper plates, I put it in there and can take home whatever I don't want, or I take it with me to a restaurant. So there all are alternatives, and, it is cheaper and healthier to eat at home, so that's a behavioral change also. I really would like to go ahead with a public hearing, and the reason I want to do that is because I want more information. And I think there's so many people in our community that are interested in this and could bring us more information, both about what is possible and about what would be acceptable. I think we could get the basics out there and then figure out the details of the consequences, fees, deposits, doing it in steps, things like that. I'd really like to get a public hearing. I have a motion to ask for that. If it fails, I'd like to ask for another work session. Can I do that?
You can make another motion.
Yes, okay, so that's where I'm at. I'm hoping you don't think it's too much of a surprise. I didn't get it together to write it until today, but I think you knew it was coming. So I move to direct the city manager to prepare and schedule a public hearing on an ordinance that prohibits caterers, restaurants, grocery stores, and nonprofit food servers from, 1, providing plastic straws, and I would add, except on request, serving or packaging food and beverages in products made of polystyrene or other single-use plastic products, including, and this is my long list that can be whittled down, but I think it's easier to talk about it and take it out than add it. Containers and wrappers, plates, bowls, cups, and lids, stirrers and utensils, and condiment packages.
Second.
Okay, I know Mike wants to speak to this. Anyone else? And Alan. Okay, Mike and Alan.
Yeah, I guess when we're having this work session, when we have the process of asking a poll for a work session, some basics are put on the form. So when Emily did that, the staff has a general idea of what to prepare for and what information to bring us. Your motion that you wrote today is a good one, and it's very specific, though. And I guess I would offer the friendly amendment to just substitute a public hearing for an additional work session so that staff could come back to us and say, okay, with that particular motion, here are the pros and cons best we can figure of what will be the impacts and the potential unintended consequences of doing this. Because there are an awful lot of them, and whether the general public knows or not that there's a public hearing on something that they may want to have, it is a matter of one news cycle, and I don't think we may catch a lot of people unaware. And so I would just suggest, I would vote in favor of the motion if you accept the friendly that says, come back to another work session to, with information about the effects of that motion.
And not ask for a public hearing right now?
Correct. I would vote in favor of that.
Can I wait to hear what other people say before I accept the friendly?
That's fine with me.
Alan, you want to?
Yeah, I was going to suggest exactly the same thing. I don't know that a public hearing is ripe yet. If your motion was to bring back an ordinance to ban single-use plastics, maybe that, but I zoned out about halfway through your list, so I'm not sure about all the specifics you had in there. The specificity of it gave me a little pause. So I think actually having another work session on this, having conversation about it, thinking about, learning about more about what other communities have done, and encouraging people who want to see this happen, like we've already seen from the Osberg people and the Turtle that came on Monday, to come and talk to us at the forum, which is a common place for them to do that, to come and give us some more ideas. And then once we get a better idea about that, then we can formulate something that has more notice about it. Having, just heard this a minute ago gives me a little pause. I don't like to operate that way. So I think it's better if we do it as a work session based on that, to then formulate something that could go out to a public hearing and give people the forum opportunity in our other meetings to come and talk to us about some good ideas, and we can learn some stuff. Now that people know this is on the agenda, we'll hear about it. Right.
Okay. Greg, do you want to speak to it too?
Yeah, I kind of want to ditto what both Alan and Mike said, but one of the other things that came to my mind was practices that people do, and this may seem minor, that create what I would consider barriers for reusables. And I'll give you an example, an anecdotal example. Most weekends, I'm on the road with my daughter in a basketball tournament or softball tournament. Some of those things happen around here. And most of the time, they don't want you to bring in your own food.
Right.
And, my wife always sneaks in our own food in a bag. And all of our stuff is recyclable materials. But if you buy food at these places, I would say 90% of the materials that those foods are packaged in, or whatever they're going to serve you, are going to be, single-use plastics in some form or fashion or another. So I would like for us to have a little bit more depth in terms of looking at what those specific barriers are and how we can remove those barriers so that, the sports event can make the money that they want to make, but at the same time, there could be a happy medium where we are encouraging people to bring in reusables versus having people use single usage. And it's not just those kinds of events, but there are other kinds of events that have those kinds of inbuilt situations to them.
I'm going to give Chris a chance, and we are short on time, so, I would actually like to wrap this up. We're clearly going to come back to it in one form or another. Okay, Chris?
Yeah, just quickly, I'm supportive of the notion of having another work session. And I think in the interest of saying there are some things we might be able to move on quickly, even as a result of that, after that work session, I think the notion of polystyrene foam containers, I think that could be a ban that could be implemented relatively easily. Only getting straws on request, that's one that you could do pretty easily. So I think there are some low-hanging fruit elements that probably would be desirable to have, might not create that much of an impact, but I wouldn't want to do that till after we have another work session and go there. So if the friendly to change it into another work session is accepted, then I'm happy to vote for that.
You want to?
Yeah, I'll talk. I'm happy to get rid of my list. I just thought that was clearer. So, ban single-use products. I can count. I can see I'm not going to get a public hearing right now. So I will accept the friendly. I would hope that people would rally up and we would get this information sooner than later. I think it's an important statement to make. The state may ban the polystyrene and the straws on their own. I think we should make a bigger statement than that. I would ask that if another work session does pass, that we could have it very quickly. So I accept the friendly.
Okay, and does the second accepts the friendly?
And that, so so you just eliminated the list and asked for a
Because we'll
public hearing.
talk about it in the work session.
And so there's also a whole bunch of other things that were listed, like deposits and things like that. I assume that's
Yeah,
kind
I
of
just
stuff you-
figured we could figure that out after we got.
Right. So
the
all that
what,
information come back
then,
to
you
us.
know, when and how much and deposits and all that seems the nitty-gritty
that's
of
acceptable.
implementation.
It's acceptable to me. And I had one more comment.
Okay. You have one more comment also?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
All right.
It's a quick one. And Betty, with regard to your comment about creating more foodways for people, when I go to restaurants and they want to bring me one of those things or one of those things, I say, no, please don't give me that. Put it in aluminum foil. Aluminum foil is very readily available, and it's also recyclable, and you just need to wash it and put it in your thing. And I never walk away with saying I don't want it, because aluminum foil is readily available as an alternative, which is recyclable. So that doesn't create any food waste.
So are we clear on, everyone's clear on the motion? Do you need to?
Mike still had.
Just one last like that. Greg made a comment that was really important about bringing his own Tupperware for the sake of leftovers or what have you. And it's important to me that the staff address the question of unintended consequences. For example, if we were to say, do something more robust about all, that affects all, carry out containers, for example, the question then comes up, would restaurants quit allowing carry out, or in what fashion? The basketball game that you go to where all of the food containers are perhaps non-recyclable, what's the impact on nonprofits to the inability to raise funds from concessions and such, let's look at all the unintended consequences that come with those pieces that we're going to talk about. Thank you.
Just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to read this really quick.
Please.
So the motion that, for Counselor Semple and the second, move to direct the city manager to prepare and schedule a work session on an ordinance that prohibits caterers, restaurants, grocery stores, and nonprofit food servers from providing plastic straws except on request and serving or packaging food and beverage in products made of polystyrene or in other single-use plastic products.
Yes.
Okay, we ready to vote? All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you all for that conversation. And now we are ready for round 2. I apologize. We're running a little bit late, and council we may need to extend. We'll see how it goes. So,
I'm sure, Greg, you won't hear about your comments when you get home. From your wife.
No.
I always do.
I just outed my wife.
On TV. We'll do a little punishment for that later, brother.
I'm sure I'm gonna hear it when I get home.
okay. Thank you. So
You
ready?
pack the bag and
All right.
sneak it in.
Down in front, down in front. All right, home energy scores.
And for the sake of time, I'll turn it over to the staff team right away.
Thank you, counselors, for having us here today. My name is Deveron Musgrave, and I'm a waste prevention and green building analyst for the city of Eugene. I'll be joined today by Chelsea Clinton, the city's sustainability manager, and Mark Nystrom, climate recovery ordinance analyst. So we're here today to talk about what a home energy score is and how it's been implemented in other communities, and to put into context how it fits within some of Eugene's climate recovery goals. In 2017, the Eugene Sustainability Commission requested that council hold a work session on home energy scoring and how a requirement that a home energy score be posted when a home is for sale or for rent. So the U.S. Department of Energy created a home energy score tool to help homebuyers assess a home's energy use. And this tool is used by several other U.S. communities, including Portland, to provide a standardized energy score for single-family homes, townhomes, and duplexes. This tool does not provide scoring for apartment buildings and similar multifamily structures. Home energy scores can be used for new or existing residences. A similar assessment tool, the Home Energy Rating System, also exists and is primarily used to score newly built homes. So in addition to Portland, other areas that require some version of a home energy score are Austin, Texas, Berkeley, California. But due to similarities in our climate and energy costs, we've discussed Portland's program with their staff in detail. So the home energy scoring process also includes a list of potential energy efficiency upgrades for the home that is scored. And in the communities that have a home energy score requirement of some kind, the actual implementation of the upgrades that would increase a home's energy scoring is voluntary. So energy efficiency upgrades can increase the comfort of a home and potentially make a home more valuable. But low energy costs in Portland and Eugene mean that for many homeowners, investing in energy efficiency upgrades will not usually pay for themselves in lowered utility expenses. Home energy scores for newly constructed homes do not receive a list of energy efficiency upgrade options, but new homes are also subject to recent residential energy efficiency code changes that require additional enhancement and conservation measures. So the state of Oregon has a certification program for individuals that would like to provide home energy scores. And a home energy score assessment and the associated data entry with the assessment process takes about an hour and a half on average. In the Portland model, sellers are required to pay a contracted energy assessor for the home energy performance report at the time that the home is listed for sale. The energy assessor inputs the home's assessment data into the U.S. Department of Energy modeling tool that provides the energy score. And in Portland, the home energy score associated with a specific property is made available through the Green Building Registry, which is built by Earth Advantage. The home energy report can be made accessible to any potential buyer through this Green Building Registry, and it is included in listings generated by the RMLS, and then populates to real estate search engines like Redfin and Zillow, et cetera. So in the rental realm, currently the University of Oregon Office of Sustainability is operating a program in partnership with City of Eugene and eWeb, where students assess rental properties and then use the U.S. Department of Energy Home Energy Score tool to generate an energy score. So U of O students earn the state's certification to provide the home energy scores and evaluate rental units. So far, approximately a third of the rentals that have been evaluated receive the lowest possible or worst energy score. And a home energy score can make potential renters aware that there are additional potentially significant costs associated with utility costs in addition to rent for certain rental homes. Publicly available energy scores could help renters determine utility costs before signing a lease. And limitations, again, of the U.S. Department of Energy tool that is being used means that certain types of buildings, like multifamily apartment buildings, are not able to be assessed. So the benefits of home energy scores for buyers and investors are that a home energy score can make a buyer aware that there are potentially significant utility costs associated with owning a particular home, and that energy improvements can potentially be financed during the purchase of a home by bundling it into the mortgage. And so with that, I'll turn the clicker over to Chelsea Clinton.
Thanks.
And a reusable cup.
With a straw.
Reusable straw.
You may recall the Sustainability Commission's recommendation on the home energy score policy included mention of its impact on the policy on the Climate Recovery Ordinance, or the CRO. We wanted to take this opportunity to help draw that connection for you. You probably remember that the CRO includes 4 climate action goals. 2 are directed towards the city organization and 2 are for the community. The first goal calls for all city-owned facilities and city operations to be carbon neutral by 2020. The second goal calls for the city organization to reduce fossil fuel use by 50% by 2030 compared to 2010 usage. Similar to the second goal, the third goal calls for the community to reduce fossil fuel use by 50% by 2030 compared to 2010 usage. And the fourth goal calls for the community to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. This is a science-based goal that calls for a 7.6% annual reduction through the year 2100. Eugene's greenhouse gas emissions can be divided into 3 buckets: consumption, transportation, and buildings. Eugene produces the most emissions in the consumption bucket, followed by transportation and then buildings. Consumption includes the emissions created from goods we consume, including emissions from the manufacturing stage all the way through disposal. So my favorite example, Greg's actually playing show and tell for me right now, is our cell phone, think about all the minerals that are mined to create the metals in your phone, and then it's manufactured, all the emissions created from that process, and then all the way through to when you're done with that phone and it's disposed of somehow, whether that's through recycling, landfill, or otherwise, all the emissions through that life cycle process. That's what products in the consumption bucket capture, and that's our largest. Transportation includes emissions from the fuel we use to power vehicles, so that's mostly gasoline and diesel. And then the buildings category includes resources we use to heat and cool buildings. So that's mostly from electricity and natural gas. Most communities focus their emissions reduction goals around their buildings and transportation emissions and only include a tiny portion of that consumption bucket when they're measuring their goals, just the waste component, and it's a very, very small proportion of that bucket. Eugene is one of only a handful of communities that has fully measured its consumption bucket in the U.S., and the only community in the U.S. that staff has been able to find that bases, that includes this bucket when measuring progress towards our greenhouse gas emissions goals. There are several reasons why most communities focus on the buildings and transportation buckets. First, we and other communities are able to measure the buildings and transportation buckets relatively precisely, making it possible to track progress from year to year. While strides continue to be made in measurement of the consumption bucket, it remains difficult to measure. Some of those reasons include the need to incorporate a variety of data from international sources and the difficulty of determining what exactly each of us as individuals are consuming in Eugene each year. The second reason we focus on those two buckets is because it represents opportunities that the city of Eugene and most cities have the most leverage or control over. So for example, by implementing plans like the TSP and reducing emissions through your work around natural gas and UWEB's work around electricity, these are places where the city can make significant reductions and why we focus on these buckets. With all that said, it's important to continue to track and work towards emissions reduction for that consumption bucket. You, the Eugene City Council, and the Eugene community have and continue to be leaders when addressing climate change. As you know, the real goal around all this work is about lowering global greenhouse gas emissions. The only way we achieve that greater goal is to understand our full impact as a community and to strive to reduce our footprint on the planet. So next, Mark is going to present the projected emissions impact of the home energy score policy. For this portion of the presentation, we're going to set aside the consumption bucket and focus on the transportation and really the buildings bucket because we have more recent and accurate data. It's not because we aren't tracking that bucket and continuing to work on making improvements there. So if we take the transportation and building buckets as our whole pie for this conversation, we can think of that buildings bucket as accounting for about 36% of our community's emissions.
Thank you, Chelsea. So let's focus in on that building bucket. You'll see in the presentation that approximately 36% of the total emissions come from energy used in buildings. If we want to break this down further, we can see that residential buildings account for about 102,000 metric tons of CO2, or about 11% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Further and we have to focus on single-family homes and mobile homes because those are the ones that this program will apply to. We see that single-family homes only account for about 82,000 metric tons of CO2, or 9% of Eugene's greenhouse gas emissions. There are about 43,000 single-family homes in Eugene. According to the National Association of Realtors, approximately 5% of the housing stock are sold each year. So if every home sold receives a home energy score, and the owner invests in energy upgrades that reduce their home's greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, the net impact will be approximately 2,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents. That's a 0.2% reduction in Eugene's annual emissions. From a climate change and greenhouse gas perspective, the home energy score will take us a step in reducing Eugene's greenhouse gas emissions. So some considerations to take when reflecting on the home energy score. The cost of implementing the home energy score in Portland currently requires a single FTE and programmatic costs. While Portland's home energy score program requires a mandatory score, any upgrades are voluntary. In Portland's experience, approximately 5 to 10% of homes receiving a home energy score invest in the recommended energy upgrades. On the previous slide, I made assumptions, or we made assumptions, that every home reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by half. These are very optimistic assumptions. In other communities, there are organizations that are opposed to implementing a mandatory home energy score. And finally, the U.S. Department of Energy's methodology only applies to single-family homes. It's not applicable to multifamily homes. So looking at next steps, as you can see from the headline, earlier this week, the Oregon Department of Energy announced that Oregon's nonprofit Earth Advantage will serve as a statewide implementer of Oregon's home energy program. Based on a conversation just yesterday with Roger Kanu from the Department of Energy, the state is prepared to offer software for the program, certification and quality control of assessors, and the platform to provide information to consumers. Additionally, the Oregon Department of Energy has some capacity to provide support for communities looking to implement a home energy score. These resources will be helpful if we decide to implement this program in Eugene. We anticipate the need for additional resources, particularly if Eugene decides to implement a mandatory program. We hope this information has been useful, and we're not asking you to take action today. Our team will be providing you several updates in the coming weeks. On January 30th, staff will provide an update on the Northwest Natural Gas agreements and a Climate Action Plan 2.0 update. The update will include a list of possible actions that could help us reach our greenhouse gas reduction goals. This list will give you more information to review as part of a comprehensive set of actions, including those that will reduce the size of emissions in our building bucket. So that's our presentation, and we're open for any questions or comments.
Great. I have Mike, Alan, Emily, and Betty in the queue. So take it away.
Forgive me, may I let
and
Greg go
Oh,
first?
Greg.
'Cause his hand
People
was up
are
well
waving
before
at me,
mine.
but I didn't know who was waving. Okay.
I'll go after Greg.
So Greg, take it away. And you-
Thanks, Mayor.
It wasn't you, Greg. Okay.
Can you help me with this? And I think it would be instructive and illustrative for those folks watching at home. What is the emission difference between a home that is heated by natural gas versus one that's heated by electric in this community?
It's a really good question. We're going to have to get back to you with the specific numbers.
Councilor Zelenko would like to answer.
Not unless our chief over here knows the answer.
You too?
Well, because EWEB, for instance, is predominantly hydro, 85% of their energy, the electrically heated home has zero emissions from that hydroelectricities, and overall, the emissions from an electrically heated home are substantially lower than a natural gas heated home, which is a direct use of natural gas, and therefore combustion and therefore greenhouse gas emissions.
But
Huge.
what are those specific numbers?
It depends on the size of the house and the type of equipment. It's not, and the average, I don't know what the average is.
We could get back to you with.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be some
Huge
kind
because
of
EWEB's hydro.
EWEB is powered by water and the whole thing, but you know, we have to have a comparative, you know, way of presenting that analysis to the public as we go out and say, look, you know, this is how much, you know, we are contributing in carbon emissions based on the fact that we are using natural gas and other fossil fuels versus using hydro based power, you know, to heat our homes and do those kinds of things. Because I think once people see that, then they understand that making different investments are critical and important to moving the dial.
Okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Except for the heating a home with gas, excuse me, so sorry, is a significantly lower cost often, as is the using of it in the process than the electricity, comparatively speaking. But more importantly is this, when we make these sort of binary comparisons, one of the things we never talk about is systemic capacity. So we have a capacity to produce X amount of electricity. Let's say, and on this hypothetically, we stopped using gas entirely in our community. Well, one could make the argument that individual homeowners would use less gas, obviously, in that scenario. But how much more, what's the carrying capacity of hydroelectricity generated by hydro versus, okay, now the demand for electricity is up here and we can only do so much in hydro, so now we have to burn gas in order to get the extra electricity. That capacity question is real when we start to consider this on a grander scale of citywide sort of discussions. There's also something here that was really interesting to me. Mark, you said 43,000 homes in our community and 5% turnover every year?
Yeah, that's what I found on the webpage.
One of the things that, and please, that's awesome. I appreciate that information. Well, I would love to make sure we do a really good job of having this discussion with accurate data. I'm not saying yours isn't. I'm saying we had a consultant in the other day that talked to us about housing and said that, you know, there's a lot of data in that economic forecast. One of them says there's 63,000 houses in Eugene, not 43, and it says there are 54,000 in Salem. That was one of the big comparison things I thought was interesting, and I mentioned the other night. So that's a fairly significant difference of single-family homes, is what it was listed. The second thing is, as I work in this field, and the Register Guard publishes once a year that there are about 5,000 transactions of single-family homes every year. 5% of 43,000 is 2,000. So there's a fairly significant difference of information here. And I would hope that when we have things like this presented to us across multiple, I don't know which one's right and which one isn't, but there's some pretty significant differences being discussed here. So thanks.
Alan?
Yeah, just one comment on natural gas and Northwest Natural. They're moving leaps and bounds towards renewable natural gas and reducing the carbon intensity of their supply. In fact, they just published their deep decarbonization study, which is actually very impressive. And just be clear for the record, not in favor of natural gas ban. There's lots to do to reduce the greenhouse gas impacts of natural gas use first, so that's where we should be going. And on RPS for reduction of impacts of greenhouse gas and carbon intensity I think is the first place we should be going. Also, full disclosure, the people that do this program at Oregon Department of Energy work for me. So I naturally think this is a really good idea. Basically because people, in order to take action, need information. Right now, there's no information about this. When you buy an appliance, for instance, you know what the energy score is. You know that this appliance costs you $180 a year and this one costs you $500. You're going to buy this one and weighing the differential incremental costs. Right now, we don't have that information about homes. And the greenhouse gas impact, while it's a little bit, it's small, this is that silver buckshot thing. We're going to do a lot of these. We're going to see these coming at us all the time now for the next 25 years. And it's all that silver buckshot that builds up to a big impact on greenhouse gases. So, but the biggest thing about this is really about the operating costs, especially as it relates to lower income people. The biggest part of owning a house is your mortgage, but then there's the cash flow around operating the house. So if you pay the utility bill, that becomes a big deal, especially if you're a low-income person. And being able to choose a rental property, which you don't have to pay the mortgage, you have to pay the rent, based on how much energy that house uses, allows people and enables choices based on that information. So you can choose then to use or rent the house that has the lower operating costs for your energy. The other thing I would comment about this is that this is really a new idea. It's just starting. Right now, it's only limited to single-family homes. There's multifamily part's going to come later. And because it's new, this information and all this access to it now appliances has been around for 25 years doing all that stuff. People take that for granted. Hopefully we'll get there sooner with houses when we do stuff like this. The information will take a long time to change people's behaviors about this and improve the information. Maybe we get EWEB incentives to focus in on the low score folks to get us incentive programs to get landlords of those poorly performing rental houses to improve their stock. I think we should, we've been doing this voluntarily for a while, and other places have done it for a while, and it doesn't work. It either needs to have to be kind of all in or not. It needs to be a mandatory thing. I don't think we're there yet, but we need to, that's where we should be working. Portland had a bumpy start, and they're moving forward, and I think I need another round.
All right.
A couple more points.
Okay, Betty.
Thank you. I definitely think we should go forward with a home energy score. My question is, I think you indicated that we don't need to do anything today to keep this going. Is that right?
So what we said is that we're going to be coming back, currently scheduled on January 30th, with a list of different actions that could help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Some of those will also be related to that bucket, the buildings bucket, and there'll be different trade-offs there in terms of impact and cost. And so from a staff perspective, it seemed to make sense for you to have all that information before moving forward on a particular program.
So we don't need a motion today if we want to
That would be the staff's perspective.
do something.
Right. We would suggest that you wait until you
We can assume that we will get another opportunity, because I was prepared to make a motion that we bring back some. I think this would not be, when you said mandatory, this does not mean it's mandatory for all homeowners, right? If there were a mandatory home energy score, this would be for homes that are for rent or for sale.
There's many decision points that could be made around the program, so it could be voluntary or mandatory. I mean, right now, anyone can go get a home energy score as it is, so it'd be a good discussion to have why we would have a voluntary program, what improvement that would make. And then Portland's model shows us a model around when homes are sold, so the score is required at point of sale. The rental model, we would need to explore what that would look like, but there are a lot of different decision points you could make.
No one's going to go to every home and say, well, you have to have a score.
That would be a decision that you all would need to help us make.
Okay, I definitely think we should should do something about this, but thank you.
Emily.
Thank you for the report and bringing this to us from my poll. I think it's important. I agree. We don't need to do anything right now because the state information is coming and you're going to take care of us. I just want to reiterate every little bit for the greenhouse gas emissions. We have to pay attention. We can't just assume that we'll, get rid of cars tomorrow and we'll take care of it. Every little bit counts, and every little thing we can do brings the people together as a unified community to make a difference. And Alan put it beautifully about helping people. If I was going to rent, and I know it's really hard to find two to choose from, but if I could, I would be influenced by the better score, and that would get it an incentive, if we ever have any housing stock, for people to do the score and to get their scores lower so they could get better prices both for rent and sales. So I see a lot of advantages to it, and I'm very encouraged. People seem to be interested in it, and I look forward to watching it develop. So thank you very much.
Okay, I have a couple second rounds. Alan and then Greg.
Yeah, another point is that the Sustainability Commission has been looking at this for a while. EWEB and the University of Oregon were working on this for 2 years or longer, and so that's where this comes from. Portland already implemented it. I think Portland, while they had a bumpy start, it's working fairly well now, and it's only on sales of homes. So it's not every house, Betty. It's only if you're going to put your house up for sale. And Earth Advantage, who's the implementer, has actually figured this out and automatically takes the score and uploads it onto the multiple listings. And it's just a box in the multiple listings, so it happens like that. But one of the problems they had in Portland was that they didn't have the assessors right at the beginning. And so it added time to get the assessors to do the analysis to get into the multiple listing before they could list the house. And if we were going to do that, we would want to make sure that the assessors were in place and ready to go and then implement the program, not the other way around. In Portland, they had like 206 people, I think, are certified to do this assessment. And they created, and then it kind of got mature, and they created businesses that just do this and work with realtors. And so now it works a lot more smoothly, and now there's only about 20 businesses and 20 folks that actually do that. And they've got it honed down to like it's $149 per assessment. And so it's matured. So we get the advantage of having all of that learning. But we do need to do that smooth transition. It does get paid for by the consumer. It's not something the city of Eugene would do. And actually with all the information, all the tools already available, the lift for the city of Eugene is actually very light. It's already set up just for us to say go, and all the tools and the guidelines and the help that is given by the Oregon Department of Energy and assistance from Portland and what the lessons learned would make this a very easy thing for us actually to do, and not all FTE on our part, not expense on our part. So it, I think would be actually fairly simple to move forward. Then the hard part gets when you implement it, but yeah.
Greg?
Yeah. Alan, you just talked about before in your last comment, recyclable natural gas.
Renewable.
What is renewable? How does that work? And what is the net effect in terms of lowering emissions, if any?
Renewable natural gas is basically any kind of natural gas that comes from a non-fossil fuel source, food waste, Metropolitan
Like
Wastewater Commission from methane from our waste. All of those are considered renewable natural gas. The Oregon Department of Energy just by a bill that was created in the last session, not the short session before that, has an inventory now of all the technical potential of the renewable natural gas, and it's something like 20 to 30% of Northwest Natural's gas can be displaced by this renewable natural gas, and therefore substantially reducing the overall carbon intensity of their supply.
So cow gas.
Cow gas, food waste, agricultural waste. There's a whole list of different ways to get it, like that are all technically very doable.
Interesting. Okay, any other questions? This feels like a no-brainer to me, like a really excellent thing to do. So I'll be interested in as you come back, how this looks within the whole scope of menu of options that the council has. But I really appreciate both Alan and Emily's comments about the equity component here. Is this the goal of also just creating the quality, creating a setting in which we could have better quality housing? Because there are a lot of people that are living in houses that are too cold in winter and too hot in summer. So it would be nice to feel that we had made some progress accomplishing two things, climate recovery and better living conditions for folks. So as soon as we can have the supply, as Emily says. So I think that we'll come back. We'll see you on the 30th for this. So thank you very much. Excellent report, very interesting, and look forward to the next chapter.
Thank you.
And we are adjourned. On time, believe it or not.